Everyone knows how the Greek heroes lived. The monsters they killed. The wars they won. The impossible things they did that we still talk about 3,000 years later. Almost nobody knows how they died. That's not an accident. The endings were so strange, so cruel, and so ironic that the stories almost feel like a different mythology. One where the greatest warriors in history are killed by robes, by firewood, by rotting ships, and by their own families. These are the deaths of the 10 greatest heroes of Greek mythology, starting with the most famous survivor who ever lived, and the one death he never saw coming. The hero who could never escape fate. There was a prophecy. Long before Odysseus ever reached home, the blind prophet Theseus told him how his story would end. Death would come to him from the sea. Odysseus must have thought he understood. The sea had been trying to kill him for 10 years. It took every ship he commanded and every man who followed him. He escaped the Cyclops, the Sirens, the whirlpool that swallowed his raft whole. He came home to Ithaca, killed the 100 suitors camped in his palace, and reclaimed his wife, his son, and his throne. The story was over. He had won. And that is exactly when the prophecy started moving. Years earlier, on the island of the witch Circe, Odysseus had fathered a son he never knew existed. His name was Telegonus. The boy grew up across the sea, asking one question: who is my father? Until Circe finally told him, and sent him to find the king of Ithaca. She armed him for the journey with a spear like no other in Greek mythology. Its tip was not bronze. It was the barbed, venomous spine of a stingray, a weapon pulled from the sea itself. Telegonus landed on Ithaca, and didn't know it. Thinking he'd reached some foreign shore, he and his crew began raiding cattle on the beach. And when word reached the palace that pirates were on the coast, an aging king strapped on his armor one last time and marched down to defend his island. Father and son met on that beach as strangers. The fight was short. Telegonus drove his spear into the man leading the defenders, and the stingray venom did the rest. Only as Odysseus lay dying did the two men learn each other's names. Death had come from the sea, not as a storm, not as a monster, as a fishbone on the end of a spear, in the hand of his own son. This ending isn't in Homer, it comes from a lost epic called the Telegony, written around the 6th century BC and surviving only in ancient summaries. But the Greeks told it for centuries, maybe because it completed the lesson of the Odyssey. The man who could talk, trick, and sail his way out of anything could not outmaneuver fate. The world's greatest escape artist died of the one thing he never saw coming. The strongest man alive, destroyed by a shirt. No monster killed Heracles. The Nemean lion couldn't do it. The Hydra couldn't do it. Cerberus, the guard dog of hell itself, couldn't do it. The strongest hero in Greek mythology was killed by a gift from the woman who loved him. Years after the 12 labors, Heracles was traveling with his wife, Deianira, when they came to a flooded river. A centaur named Nessus offered to carry her across. Halfway over, he tried to steal her. He'd picked the wrong husband. Heracles put an arrow in him from the far bank. An arrow dipped in the Hydra's venom, the deadliest poison in the world. But Nessus, dying, played one last card. He whispered to Deianira that his blood was a love charm. If Heracles ever strayed, she need only rub it on his clothes, and he would love her again forever. She believed him. She bottled the blood of a poisoned centaur, and kept it for years. Then, one day, she heard the rumor she'd always feared. Heracles had brought home a beautiful young princess from his latest conquest. Desperate, Deianira remembered the charm. She soaked a ceremonial robe in the centaur's blood and sent it to her husband as a gift. The moment the robe touched his skin, his own body heat activated the Hydra venom hidden in the blood. The poison burned like liquid fire. When Heracles tore at the robe, his flesh came away with it. The man who had wrestled monsters barehanded couldn't fight fabric. No enemy had ever made him scream. The robe did. Knowing there was no cure, Heracles chose his own ending. He ordered a funeral pyre built on the summit of Mount Ida, climbed onto it while still alive, and asked his friends to light it. Only one man, the archer Philoctetes in most versions, could bring himself to do it, and Heracles gave him his legendary bow in payment. The fire took his mortal body. But the myth doesn't end in ashes. Zeus lifted the divine half of his son to Olympus, where the greatest of heroes finally became a god, and made peace, at last, with Hera herself. Still, mark the scoreboard. Every monster in Greece 0. 1 jealous centaur, 1 frightened wife, 1 piece of laundry. Heracles, the strongest man who ever lived, was killed by the people who loved him. The invincible warrior, killed by the man he respected least. Here's what most people get wrong about Achilles. In Homer's Iliad, there is no invulnerable skin and no magic heel. That legend, his mother dipping him in the river Styx, holding him by one ankle, appears centuries later in Roman poetry. Homer's Achilles is just a man, the fastest, deadliest man alive, who knows exactly when he's going to die, because that was the deal. His goddess mother told him his 2 fates: stay home and live a long, forgotten life, or sail to Troy, win eternal glory, and die young. Achilles chose glory, and for years the price stayed theoretical. Nobody at Troy could touch him. When he finally faced Hector, Troy's greatest defender, Achilles killed him, tied the body to his chariot, and dragged it through the dust in front of the man's family. That was the peak of his power. He had less than a season to live. The arrow that killed Achilles came from the walls of Troy, fired by Paris, the pampered prince who had started the whole war, the archer who fought from safety while better men died in the dirt. To a Greek warrior, there was no more humiliating hand to die by. But Paris didn't aim that arrow alone. The traditions agree the god Apollo guided the shot, a god with a grudge, whose priests and favorites Achilles had cut down. The arrow found the one target no one could have hit on purpose. In the later legend, the single dry patch of skin where his mother's grip had kept the sticks from touching him. His heel, the smallest wound in Greece, brought down its greatest warrior. Some ancient versions tell an even darker story, that Achilles was lured into a temple of Apollo to negotiate a marriage, and ambushed there, unarmed, inside a sanctuary where weapons were forbidden. Either way, the meaning is the same. No duel, no last stand, no warrior strong enough to beat him. He was removed, from a distance, by an enemy he despised and a god he couldn't reach. Achilles got exactly what he chose. The glory is still here, 3,000 years later. You know his name, and his heel lives on in the dictionary. But he never saw Troy fall. He never went home. Eternal fame, at the price of never being alive to enjoy it. He knew the trade. He made it anyway. The hero who escaped the labyrinth and was pushed off a cliff. Theseus is the reason Athens existed as a legend. He volunteered for the death ships sent to Crete, walked into the labyrinth where a bull-headed monster waited in the dark, killed the Minotaur with his bare hands, and followed Ariadne's thread back into the light. No hero had ever done anything like it. He came home a king, and Athens rose around him. That's the half of the story everyone knows. The other half is a slow-motion collapse. Because the older Theseus grew, the worse his decisions became. The final disaster was a pact with his best friend, Pirithous. Each would help the other kidnap a daughter of Zeus as a bride. Theseus took the young Helen of Sparta years before Troy. Pirithous aimed higher, insanely higher. He chose Persephone, the wife of Hades. The two heroes walked into the underworld alive to steal the queen of the dead. Hades received them politely. He offered them chairs. They sat, and the stone fused to their flesh and held them, and the two men who had cheated death sat frozen in the dark for years. Pirithous never left. Theseus was freed only when Heracles came down for Cerberus and tore him loose, leaving, some traditions say, part of him still stuck to the seat. The king who returned to Athens was a diminished, half-broken man, and his city had moved on. Rivals held his power. His name meant less every year. Eventually Theseus accepted exile and sailed to the small island of Skyros, where King Lycomedes welcomed him as an honored guest. Hospitality was sacred law in Greece. A guest stood under the protection of Zeus himself. Lycomedes smiled, hosted him, and feared him. An aging legend was still a legend, and legends attract followers. So one day the king took Theseus walking on the high cliffs above the sea, two old men admiring the view. And at the edge, without warning, without witnesses, without a single word recorded. Lycomedes pushed. The man who escaped the Minotaur's maze and the halls of Hades fell in silence, and the sea took him. Centuries later, Plutarch tells us, the Athenians found giant bones on Skyros and carried them home in glory, believing their founder had finally returned. Maybe it was him, maybe it wasn't. Either way, the lesson had been written. Theseus survived every monster in the dark. It was a handshake in the daylight that killed him. The hero crushed by his own trophy. Jason's legend was built on one impossible voyage. To win back a stolen throne, he assembled the greatest crew in mythology, Heracles, Orpheus, the finest heroes of a generation. Aboard the Argo, a ship built with Athena's own guidance, they crossed seas no Greek had ever survived, past clashing rocks and a bronze giant, to the edge of the known world, to steal the golden fleece from a king who had no intention of giving it up. The king set impossible trials, fire-breathing bulls, a field sown with dragon's teeth that sprouted armed warriors, a sleepless dragon coiled around the prize itself. Jason survived all of it for one reason. The king's daughter, Medea, a sorceress and the granddaughter of the sun god, she fell in love with the handsome stranger, and she did everything. Her ointments made him fireproof. Her cunning defeated the earthborn warriors. Her spells put the dragon to sleep. Then she betrayed her own family and fled with him across the sea. Jason came home a legend, with the fleece in his hands and Medea at his side. And then, years later, he threw her away. A better marriage appeared. A princess of Corinth, a royal future, and Jason took it. He forgot what his wife was capable of. Medea sent the new bride a wedding gift, a beautiful robe that burst into unquenchable flame when she put it on. The fire consumed the princess and the king who tried to save her. And then Medea did the unthinkable, the deed Euripides made immortal. She killed the two young sons she had borne to Jason and vanished into the sky in the sun god's chariot. She left Jason alive. That was the punishment. No wife, no children, no kingdom, no quest. The gods turned their faces from a man who had broken his sacred oath, and the greatest captain of his age simply faded. He became an old man haunting the beach where his glory days ended, sitting in the shadow of the Argo itself, beached, abandoned, rotting on the sand. And one day, as he sat beneath the ship one last time, the rotten stern gave way. The falling timber crushed him where he sat. No witnesses, no battle, no last words. The ship that made Jason a legend became his headstone. The Greeks understood exactly what that ending meant. His greatness was never his own. The ship carried him, and Medea saved him every single time. When everything that made him a hero finally collapsed, it collapsed on top of him. The best man in the war, abandoned by the gods. Hector is the only hero on this list who never wanted glory. He was the crown prince of Troy, a husband, a father, and when his brother Paris started an unwinnable war over a stolen queen, Hector inherited the job of fighting it, not for fame, because there was no one else standing between the Greek army and his family. Homer gives him the most human moment in the entire Iliad. Saying goodbye to his wife, Hector reaches for his infant son, and the baby bursts into tears, terrified of his father's war helmet. So Hector takes it off, laughing, and kisses his boy. Then he puts the helmet back on and walks to a battle he already knows he cannot win. His death was set in motion by a case of mistaken identity. Achilles' closest friend, Patroclus, rode into battle wearing Achilles' armor. Hector killed him and only then learned who wasn't inside it. When Achilles heard, his grief turned him into something barely human, and all of it aimed at one man. When Hector saw Achilles coming for him, the bravest man in Troy ran 3 times around the walls of his own city, with his parents watching from the battlements. Don't mistake it for cowardice. He simply understood, better than anyone alive, exactly what was chasing him. Then a goddess ended the chase. Athena, who wanted Troy destroyed, appeared beside Hector disguised as his brother, promising to fight at his side. Hector stopped, turned, faced Achilles with his brother at his back. He threw his spear, missed, turned for a second weapon, and there was no one there. There never had been. The goddess was gone, and Hector understood, in one terrible instant, that heaven itself had tricked him into his grave. Achilles' spear found the gap at his throat. What followed shocked even the gods. Achilles pierced the dead man's ankles, roped him to his chariot, and dragged Troy's greatest defender through the dust. Around the very walls he died protecting, day after day, while his family watched. It took a broken old man to end it. King Priam, Hector's father, walked unarmed into the enemy camp at night, knelt before his son's killer, and kissed the hands that had done it. Even Achilles wept. He gave the body back. The Iliad, the first great war story ever written, does not end with a victory. It ends with Hector's funeral. 3,000 years ago, Homer already knew. The noblest man in a war is rarely the one who wins it. Sometimes it's the one who knows he can't, and fights anyway. The strongest man in the army, defeated by an insult. No one ever beat Ajax in battle. Not Hector. Their famous duel ended in a draw and an exchange of gifts. Not the Trojans, who broke against his shield like water. He was the wall of the Greek army. The biggest man on the field, carrying a shield like a tower, holding the line alone whenever everything collapsed. When Achilles fell, it was Ajax who carried his body out of the storm of arrows, on his own shoulders, fighting as he went, which made what happened next unbearable. Achilles' divine armor, the most precious prize in the army, was to be awarded to the worthiest hero left alive. Two names mattered. Ajax, the strongest, who had bled for every Greek in the camp, and Odysseus, the talker. The commanders gave the armor to Odysseus. For a man built entirely out of honor, the verdict wasn't a disappointment. It was an erasure. A lifetime of shields raised and lines held, outweighed by a clever speech. That night, something in Ajax broke, and Athena, protector of Odysseus, gave the broken thing a push. She wrapped his mind in madness. Ajax rose in the dark, took his sword, and slaughtered the Greek commanders in their tents. Agamemnon, Menelaus, Odysseus, all of them, cut down one by one. Except they weren't. When dawn came and the madness lifted, Ajax stood in a field of butchered sheep and cattle. He had spent the night killing livestock, believing they were kings. The army's greatest warrior, ankle-deep in slaughtered animals, and the whole camp laughing. He could survive any wound. He could not survive being ridiculous. Ajax walked out alone to the shore and planted a sword in the earth, point up. Not just any sword, the one Hector had given him after their duel, warrior to warrior, the only man who'd ever matched him. Respect from an enemy turned into the instrument of his exit. He prayed for his family, cursed his judges, and fell on the blade. The final irony arrived at his funeral. The commanders wanted to deny him burial, and the man who stood up and shamed them into honoring Ajax properly was Odysseus. The rival whose victory had destroyed him became the last defender of his honor. Every other hero on this list was killed by fate, gods, or family. Ajax is the only one killed by an opinion. The deepest wounds, the Greeks knew, are not made with swords. The king who survived 10 years of war and one bath at home. Agamemnon commanded the largest army the Greek world had ever assembled. 1,000 ships, every king of Greece under his banner. He besieged Troy for a decade, watched it burn, and sailed home in triumph with treasure and glory beyond any king before him. He walked through his own front door and never came out again. The trap had been set 10 years earlier by Agamemnon himself. When the fleet first gathered for Troy, the winds died. The goddess Artemis, offended by the king, had stopped the sea. Her price for wind was monstrous. His daughter Iphigenia on a sacrificial altar. He paid it. He lured his own child to the coast with a promise of marriage and sacrificed her for weather. The fleet sailed, and back in the palace, Queen Clytemnestra, Iphigenia's mother, began to wait. She waited 10 years. She took a lover with his own blood debt against the king. Together they ruled and planned and let the war do its work. When Agamemnon finally returned, she met him at the door like a devoted wife. She rolled out precious crimson cloth for his feet. She drew him a warm bath, the conqueror's reward, and the one place a soldier takes off everything: armor, weapons, vigilance. As he relaxed into the water, Clytemnestra threw a heavy robe over him, woven, in some tellings, into a net with no opening for head or hands. Tangled, blind, and naked, the commander of all the Greeks was helpless as an animal in a snare, and his wife, with an axe, did what the entire Trojan army never could. Beside him died Cassandra, the Trojan prophetess he'd dragged home as a war prize, cursed to see the future and never be believed. She had foreseen this room, this bath, this axe. She'd said so at the gate. No one listened. No one ever did. The murder solved nothing. The house of Atreus never did. Their son Orestes grew up to avenge his father by killing his mother, and the Furies hunted him across Greece for it. Blood answering blood, a family devouring itself for another generation. Troy couldn't kill Agamemnon. 10 years of spears couldn't kill him. What killed him was a decision he'd made before the war even started, waiting patiently at home in the heart of the woman who never forgave it. The deadliest place for a king was never the battlefield. It was the bathtub. The hero who flew too high and was forced to live with it. Bellerophon did something no other hero managed. He killed the Chimera, a fused nightmare of lion, goat, and serpent that breathed fire and erased villages. Unkillable from the ground, so Bellerophon left the ground. On the back of Pegasus, the winged horse born from Medusa's blood, he became mythology's first air force. Even his method was genius. Fire made the monster's own throat a weapon against it. He tipped his spear with a block of lead, and when the Chimera opened its jaws to burn him, he drove the lead in. Its own flame melted the metal down its throat. The unkillable monster suffocated on molten lead. Kings threw impossible missions at him, enemy armies, deadly ambushes, hoping he'd die usefully. He won them all. Statues went up. His name crossed the sea. By every measure that Greece kept, Bellerophon had reached the summit of mortal glory. And that was the problem. Mortal glory stopped being enough. Somewhere in the applause, a thought took root. A man who rides the sky and kills the unkillable isn't really a man anymore. Is he? Why should he live down here, when Olympus was right up there? The Greeks had one word for that thought: hubris, and they considered it the deadliest monster of all. Bellerophon pointed Pegasus at the home of the gods and began to climb. Zeus watched the mortal rising toward Olympus. He didn't reach for a thunderbolt. For a man this proud, the king of the gods chose the smallest weapon in creation: a gadfly. One insect, one sting under the tail of Pegasus. The horse bucked in shock, at the height of the climb, above the clouds, and Bellerophon fell. Out of the sky, out of legend, all the way back to earth. And here is the cruelest part. The fall didn't kill him. That was the sentence. The traditions say he survived it, lamed or blinded, broken in body, and that no one would go near him afterward. The man the gods had rejected was a man no king would host and no crowd would cheer. The poets say he wandered a desolate plain alone, eating his own heart out, avoiding the paths of men. For years. Pegasus, by the way, made it to Olympus. Zeus kept the horse, carried his thunderbolts forever after. Every other hero on this list got a death. Bellerophon got a demonstration, pinned to the sky and dropped, alive, as a warning. The gods don't always kill you for reaching too high. Sometimes they let you land and make you live there. The hero whose life fit in a piece of firewood. You may not know Meleager's name. The Greeks ranked him with Achilles and Heracles, and they told his death first and most often because no ending in the entire mythology is quite like it. 7 days after Meleager was born, the three fates appeared beside his cradle. They pointed at the hearth, at one log burning in the fire, and spoke a sentence over the child. He will live only as long as that log lasts. His mother, Althea, lunged into the fire and snatched the log out with her bare hands. She smothered the flames, sealed it in a chest, and buried the chest deep in the palace. As long as no fire ever touched that wood, her son could not die. She had beaten the fates. She had locked her child's death in a box. For 30 years, it worked. Meleager grew into Calydon's greatest hero, famous enough that when a monstrous boar, sent by the goddess Artemis, began destroying the kingdom, every hero in Greece answered his call to hunt it. Among them came Atalanta, the fastest runner alive, a huntress raised by bears, and the only woman in the party. The men sneered at her. Meleager didn't. And when the boar finally fell, it was Atalanta's arrow that had struck first. So Meleager awarded her the hide, the trophy of the greatest hunt in Greek memory. His uncles, his mother's brothers, exploded. A woman, carrying the prize of men, they snatched the hide from her hands, and Meleager, in a flash of rage, cut them both down where they stood. Word reached the palace ahead of him, but it reached his mother wrong way first. Before she learned why, Althea heard only that her brothers were dead, and that her son had killed them. She walked to the buried chest. She took out the log she had guarded for 30 years, her son's life, held in her hands, the way it had been since his 7th day, and she threw it in the fire. Across the city, mid-triumph, Meleager felt it. A burning began inside him, matching the wood, flame for flame, and as the log collapsed into ash, the greatest hero of Calydon collapsed with it, dead without a wound, killed by a fire he never saw. Althea, when the grief hit her, took her own life. The fates had been paid in full 30 years late, by the same hands that once cheated them. Number 1 on this list because every other hero was killed by an enemy, a god, or a mistake. Meleager is the only one whose death was carried, protected, and finally delivered by the person who loved him most from the moment he was born. 10 heroes. Not one died the way heroes are supposed to. A stingray spine, a wedding gift, an arrow in the heel, a push off a cliff, a rotting ship, a goddess's trick, a borrowed sword, a bathtub, a gadfly, a piece of firewood. The Greeks who told these stories for 1,000 years weren't being cruel. They were being honest about something. Glory doesn't protect you. The monsters are never the most dangerous part of the story. The most dangerous part is family, pride, love, and fate. The things a sword can't reach. Every hero in this video has a longer story, and so does every monster they fought. Subscribe, because every legend has an ending they never tell you about.